Okay. Looks like we're going if you take it up. I can't, obviously, too short.
It's not that tall.
It's angled down, though. It's got him in a little bit of a...
Better angle.
I have a backup here, so.
Okay. All right. Oh, good morning.
Good morning.
And thanks, Pastor Luke, for beginning with morning prayer, and especially the sermon, and reminding us what the mission of the church is. And actually, as congregations go, we have an excellent mission statement. It's actually one of the best that I've seen in all of the churches that I visited. So, every year in the fall at a very nice retreat center in the woods in northern Wisconsin, Thrivent invites representatives of the Lutheran churches with which they work. For some reason, I mean, there are more than 20 Lutheran churches in the United States, but only 8 are represented, and it would be the 8 largest. And so I started attending those meetings a couple of years ago. And this past September, when we met, the theme of that gathering was trends. Trends in the church, and in particular in the Lutheran churches. And Thrivent invited, I think, 5 people, including their legal counsel, to present trends from that Thrivent itself observes, the fraternal insurance organization, the financial services company, and then from 4 other ministries, including one of our ministry partners, Youth Encounter. The new president, Tom O'Neill, was there. And then we were asked to talk about the trends within each of our Lutheran churches. And as a follow-up to the little snippet that Luke gave us in that video, you know, the overall trends of the Lutheran churches in the United States, and this would include Canada because they're almost identical, it's not a pretty picture. All of the Lutheran churches are declining. They're aging. We don't have any idea what the average age of an NELC member is, but in the ELCA, the average age of an ELCA member is now greater than 60 years old. And that's true in the other Lutheran churches as well. What's interesting is that the decline of the Lutheran churches, both in the United States and Canada, started a long time ago. All of the churches peaked in their absolute membership in the 1960s. And after 1965, they all started declining. And it was a steady decline, and almost an identical rate across the board. So when the ELCA was formed by the 3 churches, the ALC, LCA, and the small breakaway Missouri Synod group, those 3 churches, I mean, the AALC didn't have much of a history, but they wouldn't have been any different. But the ALC and LCA were declining steadily, and had been for 15 years. At the same rate that the Missouri Synod, the Wisconsin Synod, and so forth, the Free Lutheran Church and Church of the Lutheran Brethren and so forth, were declining. After the formation of the ELCA, nothing changed. The ELCA steadily declined. Now, in recent years, the ELCA stands out because its rate of decline has accelerated. But the rate of decline of the other Lutheran churches has continued. So that's not very encouraging, but worse yet, the decline in terms of the proportion of the population in North America had actually started much earlier in the 20th century. One church historian went back and tried to estimate if the Lutheran churches had kept the same proportion of the total population that they had at the start of the 20th century, if we had kept that throughout the 20th century, what would the numbers have been? At the end of the 20th century, there were 10 million Lutherans of all kinds here in the United States. But if we had kept the proportion of the population that we had at the beginning of the century, it should have been more like 40 million Lutherans. Now, obviously, there was a significant influx of immigrants from other religions, and that plays into it, and, you can kind of rationalize it away, but the truth is, we were already declining, even before the 1960s, if not in absolute numbers, as a proportion of the population. That's not how the church began, obviously. The church began centered in Jerusalem with probably a few hundred disciples. We all know about the inner circle, the 11, not counting Judas, and they replace him fairly quickly. But there were probably anywhere from 300 to 500 disciples as a part of the larger group who had followed Jesus around for at least a couple of years before his death and his resurrection. We know that on the day of Pentecost, 3,000 were added. And we also know from history that by the end of the first century, so a period of less than 70 years, the church had grown, as Jesus had said it would, starting in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and then to the ends of the earth. And in fact, at least in terms of the ends of the earth as the Roman Empire saw itself, the church, by the end of the first century, had in fact extended and grown to the ends of the Roman Empire, at least to those boundaries. The church had exponentially multiplied. And it happened because the disciples did exactly what Jesus told them to do. He discipled, especially intensely discipled, 12. And those 12 must have obeyed the Great Commission, which we've heard, and must have, and we have no way of knowing how many they each individually discipled, but over the rest of their ministry, and most of them were martyred, they must have discipled at least 12 other disciples, who themselves did exactly what Jesus said. They went out to all nations, baptizing and teaching other people to observe everything that they had learned from Jesus. It's the only way you can explain the exponential growth of the church from a few hundred to who knows how many hundreds of thousands, extending across the Roman Empire in less than 70 years. It's not just a first century phenomenon. In our lifetimes, not in the global north, certainly not in North America and Western Europe, but in the global south, the church, the Christian church, in almost all of its traditions and forms and expressions, has experienced the same exponential growth. One of my former bishops, Bishop George Mako in the Delaware, Maryland Synod, told this story that when he was at seminary in the 1950s, they were given this very gloomy, depressing prediction of what was going to happen on the continent of Africa. And that by the end of the 20th century, the continent of Africa would be almost completely Muslim. Now, has Islam grown since the 1950s and exponentially? Yes. But guess what? On the continent of Africa and in many other places, not nearly as much as the church has grown. Let's look at one example, the church with which we have a full communion relationship, the Ethiopian Mekane Yesus church, the Lutheran Church in Ethiopia. Founded in 1959 with 20,000 members. And several years later goes through an almost 20-year period of intense persecution under a communist regime. where many of their top leaders and pastors and lay leaders were not only imprisoned and tortured, but many of them martyred and executed. The church in Ethiopia grew exponentially during the communist regime. The membership is now at 6 million. It's actually beyond 6 million. And their goal is to grow within several years to about 30 million. It's not the only example. The Lutheran Church in Tanzania, in Kenya, the Anglican Church in many places, especially in Nigeria, the Methodist churches in Africa, the Pentecostal, non-denominational churches, even the Catholic Church in many of these places. And this is not only in Africa, but in Asia. The church is exponentially growing in, of all places, China. And it's growing in places where there is intense opposition. Not just from Muslims and radical Muslims, but from the governments themselves. I mean, the government of India is opposed to the Christian church and imposes all kinds of restrictions and difficulties on anybody who wants to do ministry there. And yet, the church exponentially grows. I think I've mentioned this to some of you, but a couple of years ago, Bishop John and I visited a relatively new, at the time it was 10 years old, Mekani Yesu's congregation outside the city limits of Addis Ababa. It was further up on one of the mountains, and they had, at that time, it would now be about 13 years ago, had intentionally planted a church in an area where there were no Christian churches of any kind. So the worship, or the religion in that area, was all traditional African worship. The church grew rapidly. They were able to build a huge building after about 5 years, and they had outgrown the building. They never finished the building. The only two places that were completely finished in their church were the chancel and the office where 2 women were doing job training for the poor women in their community. All of the other offices and areas, including the nave, were unfinished. Believe me, they were roughly unfinished. It was uncomfortable to stand on the rough concrete in the nave of their sanctuary. They had planted 3 other congregations, and when we were there, told us about their plans to plant 3 more congregations. And one in particular, the one that they spoke the most about, happened because a woman witch doctor in the area had converted, renounced her witch doctrine, and confessed that Jesus was her Lord and Savior. And as soon as she made that confession, the first thing she did is she went to her home. Now, her home would have been just a tiny little hut. But she burned it and everything within it. All of her witch doctrine paraphernalia. Her neighbors, watching this, all panicked. They freaked out. They thought for sure that the evil spirits were going to strike this witch doctor dead on the spot. Nothing happened to her. So her neighbors said, "Why did you do this?" And she said, "Jesus is my Lord and Savior." And then started preaching the gospel to her neighbors. And so the congregation knew that they needed first to rebuild the woman's home, start with the house church in her home, and then make plans to start a new congregation. When we walked into the pastor's office in that congregation, on a chair very much like the chairs that we sit on here, there was sitting horizontally a whiteboard about like this. And there was this elaborate diagram on it, and up at the top it had their pastor, and then there were lines going down to their 6 lay evangelists, and then lines from the 6 lay evangelists to 12 small group leaders, and then lines from the 12 small group leaders to a circle of 12 individuals. And we asked them, "What is this whiteboard? What does it mean?" And they said, "Well, that's our plan for how we make disciples in our congregation. So the pastor is responsible for discipling the 6 lay evangelists. The 6 lay evangelists are responsible for discipling the 12 small group leaders. The 12 small group leaders are responsible for gathering 12 individuals and then discipling those 12 individuals. So there's this intentional, exponential multiplication built in within the congregation in terms of how they make disciples, which is why they had already, in less than 10 years, had planted 3 other congregations with plans to start 3 more. They had already sent out 3 missionaries within Ethiopia and had plans to send missionaries from their own congregation to other countries, especially in the Middle East, outside of Ethiopia. Very intentional, exponential multiplication. And it's, as Pastor Luke said, it's very simple. It's right there. Just do what Jesus did. But we've not done that as Lutheran churches, and nor have the other Protestant churches in North America, which is why the video that you mentioned begins with those gloomy statistics, and nor has the Roman Catholic Church in North America. It's happening in the global south, but we haven't done it in North America. And I'm a good example. I mean, I'm a lifelong Lutheran. I was baptized when I was 1 month old. My parents made me and my brother and my sisters go to church every Sunday, 3 years of confirmation, 4 years of the seminary experience. And at no point in my lifetime, until recently, did anyone ever intentionally disciple me in the way that Jesus made the first disciples, and then they went out and made other disciples. Did my parents, did my pastors, did the church, did the seminary and so forth do good things for me and teach me good things? Yes. We know as Lutherans, or at least up until fairly recently, I think we did a fairly good job of teaching each other about Jesus, about God, about the Holy Spirit, about the church. But what we haven't done is intentionally discipled each other so that we're actually observing all that we learned from Jesus. This intentional multiplication. A couple of years ago, we were using a consultant with our executive council for long-range planning, strategic analysis, and his name is Rex Miller. He has an interesting book. I forget, it has Millennial or something in the title of it. But Rex was on a conference call with John and myself, and he was asking us, all right, and he'd been working with us for a few months. He said, all right, so where are you kind of, coming up against the wall? Where's the struggle? And so we said, well, we want to change the culture of our congregations so that our congregations become disciple-making congregations. And what we mean by that is that as congregations, and we've done this for a long time, there's lots of things that we do, and they're good things, and they're helpful. They help we help each other within our congregations, we help the people in our communities. But if we're not intentionally within our congregations discipling each other, then we're not doing what Jesus has commanded us to do. So we're explaining this to Rex, and Rex says to us, the most difficult thing to do is to change the culture of any institution, any organization, and in particular, congregations. And we said, yeah, we kind of sense that. I'll give you one small example. In one of my multiple meetings with Holy Trinity Lutheran Church in Grove City, Pennsylvania, so this was in the process when they were thinking about whether they should leave the ELCA and so forth, and eventually they did, and they came into the NALC, but at one point they asked me to meet with their church council. so I could tell them about the NALC. So I'm telling them about the NALC and explaining our 4 core values. And in particular, the first 2, Christ-centered, mission-driven. Because the vision and planning team that Lutheran Core put together to form the NALC had a very intentional, explicit conversation about what it means to be a mission-driven church. We talked about how it wasn't going to be sufficient to form a church that was Orthodox, confessional, Lutheran, because we knew the trends. We knew that just being an Orthodox, confessional Lutheran church didn't mean that you were necessarily going to fulfill the Great Commission, because almost all of the 20-some other Lutheran churches, excluding the ELCA, are Orthodox confessional Lutheran churches, and they've all steadily declined. And so we knew, even as we were forming the NALC, that we need to be very intentionally committed to making disciples and discipling each other. And so I'm explaining this to the Church Council at Holy Trinity in Berlin, and I finished, and this lady raises her hand, and I said, yes. And she says, are you serious? You really expect us to disciple each other so that we go out and make other disciples? And I said, yes. And she said, I don't think I could do that. It was a very honest response, because and she was probably in her 70s, and I'm guessing, like me, a lifelong Lutheran. And almost everything in her experience as a Lutheran hadn't prepared her to actually think about not only being made a disciple herself, but then intentionally discipling others. If you're going to change the culture of a congregation, it means you have to take a hard look at what your values are. Bishop John does a good job of talking about this, but you have to look at what are your values. And your values can easily be identified. They may not be what you've written out on paper or have in your constitution or in any other document. Your values are those things in which you invest the most time and energy. And of course, that's what we're going to be doing this morning. You know, where do we come close to doing what Jesus has commanded us to do, and where are we not? But if we're going to change the culture of our congregations, then our congregations are going to have to take an honest, hard look at what it is they truly value. And in many cases, some of those values are going to have to give way if we're going to be intentionally focused on first discipling each other. As Pastor Luke said, we're quick to go out, think about, okay, what is it we can do? And we think about, various programs and ideas and activities and how can we attract people, but the truth is we have to start within ourselves, individually, in our families, in our congregations. I never intentionally discipled any of our children. Never intentionally did it. I mean, I did the same things my parents did, but I didn't intentionally disciple our children. And that's where we have to start. And to make that shift means letting go of some things that have been important to us, and they may be very good things, but if they keep us, either in terms of time and energy or in terms of being a distraction, if they keep us from intentionally discipling each other and being discipled ourselves, then we need to let them go. We have time for questions.
We'll make time for questions.
Yeah. I think we go to 10:15, right? Am I right?
Yes.
Okay, so we have time for
You're good with the
questions.
schedule.
Yeah. Hey, I'm half German. I'm a Lutheran pastor. That's why we finished morning.
So how do we disciple? How does that happen on a practical basis? You pick someone and describe discipling your children or someone.
Sure. Well, actually, I'm going to use an example that I used at our Mission District Convocation. And I'm looking right at Lee because Lee says, oh, I'm one of those guys. There's all kinds of ways. I mean, you know, what Luke has given us with from the Missouri Synod is something we can use individually in our families. You know, and that's probably the best place to begin. But I'm going to use an example that has already begun in our congregation. So, now who was the second?
Ray, nice.
Ray, nice, yeah. So, I don't know how many weeks ago, sometime in the fall.
Last Lent, wasn't it?
Oh, that long ago.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So, last Lent, Luke started meeting every week with Lee and Ray. And do you meet at lunch? I never even asked. Or just whenever?
It's been once a week.
Once a week.
Yeah, I don't remember the day, but it wasn't lunchtime.
Okay, so they just meet weekly, and they began by reading a book together. And now you're in your second book, right?
Yes. Yeah, we went through the book of Romans. We actually first went through this book, What Am I Doing for Lent? Maybe some of you had that. Is that actually it took us through this kind of analysis of where are you now in this area of your life, in this area of your life, in this area of your life. And that really, it was great because it opened us up to one another. We started talking about our life and what's going on financially and what's going on here and there. And it kind of, it walks you through what you're doing for Lent. And so we kind of used that book throughout Lent, and we talked about the gospel lessons every Sunday. Then we moved on to the book of Romans and we read it using Luther's method of praying through Scripture, which if you were at that Sunday school class, we had a simple way to pray. That's the kind of the book we used concretely. And now we've taken a little bit of a hiatus, but we have intention to continue in one of the books that talks about specifically how do you do life-to-life discipleship, you know, that mentoring one-on-one.
Right, the ways to be alongside it.
Exactly.
Right, okay. So here is just one way that we could intentionally disciple each other. They may not have explicitly acknowledged this when they began, but Luke is intentionally, every week, discipling Lee and Ray. And Luke was telling me about this, and I said, well, you know what the next step is? You need to ask Lee and Ray to find two other people, and then you divide. So Luke would stop meeting with Lee and Ray. Luke would look for two other people, and they would each look for two other people, and then they start doing what they have been doing. And that's how Jesus made disciples. He said, follow me, and all these guys, most of them had no formal education or any training or experience to do what he would ask them to do, but they simply followed him and they got to know him. So one of the key parts of intentionally discipling somebody is investing time and energy. Jesus invested time and energy getting to know everything about especially the inner 12. And along the way, of course, they get to witness all of his preaching, all of his teaching, all of his healing. And then he says to them, all right, now you basically do the same thing that I've been doing with you. And that's what the early church did. And that's what they're doing in the Global South. People are finding individuals with whom they invest time and energy and intentionally learn from Jesus. So, and there's all kinds of tools, all kinds of resources, and we have many of them as a congregation, have emphasized the small catechism. But the key is this intentionality and inviting specific individuals. You know, as Luke has said, it's very important that we gather for worship and so forth. But if we don't one-on-one, life to life, invest time and energy in particular people and disciple them, with the goal of them being able to disciple others. Luke?
If you remember the analogy that Bishop John used about golfing.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, I've personally found that helpful because it really does emphasize kind of that free level and understanding, and I've experienced that to be true as well.
Sure. Yeah, and this is an analogy that we learned actually from our navigator coach, Dennis Blevins, who's been coaching, that is intentionally discipling John, myself, David Wendell, and Demetrius Buba for a year and a half now. Dennis is a golfer, and an avid golfer. So the analogy is this. You have three kinds of clubs in your golf bag, for those of you who aren't golfers. You have your driver or your fairway woods, and then you have your irons, and then you have a putter. And of course, when you get to a hole from the tee box, you use either your driver or your fairway wood. If you're a really good golfer, you can use a long iron. But basically, you're using the driver. So the driver is the one that hits the ball the furthest. You may not hit it straight, but it's the big club. And then, hopefully, if you've got a decent drive, then you can call on your irons, because your irons are your approach shot, because you're trying to get to this cup about that big on the green. So the driver isn't going to, unless you're very lucky, you're not going to get a hole in one with the driver. You might get an eagle with an iron, but your irons are your approach shot. So now ideally, you'd like to hold the ball out, but you basically are just trying to get on the green. On the green, you pull out your third kind of club, your putter. And the life-to-life discipling is using the putter. Big revivals, even in some ways, our weekly worship services is using the driver. You need the driver to get started. The irons would be the equivalent of what we're doing today, a weekly Bible study, a prayer group. You're trying to get closer to the target. What we haven't done as Christians in North America is use the putter. Most of us haven't actually gotten down to the point of actually getting the ball into the cup. And getting the ball into the cup is actually making a disciple. We do the things that are in preparation for that, things that you need to do in order to get to the point where you can use the putter, but we haven't followed through. While you were preaching, I was thinking of, it's like it's a picture on the mound. You go into the wind-up, but then you never actually follow through. Or a batter. You get yourself set, but then you never actually follow through and complete what it is you're supposed to do. And I think that's what we've neglected to do as the church. Judy?
Two things, and one of them I just thought about this morning. I know you mentioned we have many ways of books with teaching us how to be disciples, but I started reading it, and I know you mentioned ways of being alongside it. Can you just let folks here know a little bit about how that came to be, and the mentoring with navigators? And then my personal question is, I've been noting with some of the materials that I've been reading lately and through my studies, a sense of lack of joy. I mean, we come to church and we sing praises, we have a wonderful worship service, we go home and the rest of the week is, I can hardly get through the week. That we're not living that joy as Christians. But when I look at just videos or stories about the worship in, I'll use just Africa as an example, their worship services and their people seem to be so much more joyous in that, yes, we are sinners, but they have accepted the fact that they are forgiven sinners and live as forgiven sinners instead of constantly focusing on how much we are a sinner, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering, is there anything that you can help us focus on to acquire more of that daily joy? I mean, if we study and we become, have Christ in our life every day, we do live more joyously. But that's part of what we need to teach and demonstrate as well as teach. How do
Right.
we demonstrate that more?
Sure. So was the first question, how is it that we came to work with the Navigators?
Well, a little bit, and the ways of the alongside her. I mean, I'm doing that book now, although I haven't picked it up recently.
Mhm.
But I'm just doing it because we talked about it both
Right.
at the convocation down south and in the mission district, and then the league has gone through it already, and they were going to do it and try it.
Right.
So if you can, I mean, I just see the benefit of that book is I see it for me, and I think it's great.
Sure. Well, the story about how we, in terms of understanding our second core value, being mission-driven, and then honing that down onto transforming the culture of our congregations and becoming disciple-making congregations. Bishop John actually, he's the most knowledgeable Lutheran that I know of in North America in terms of how you do this, because he did it in his ministry, in particular at Grace Lutheran Church in Huntington Beach. I want to say like 6 months after I started working with him, Pastor Ray Scheck in Damascus, Maryland, whom we had known each other for many years from the Delaware Maryland Synod, asked me if we were interested in meeting with the Navigator leadership, and I said, yeah, we would. So Ray contacted somebody in Colorado Springs, and it turned out to be Roy and Margaret Fitzwater, who head the church discipleship ministry, the particular division of Navigators working with. And it was a relatively new part of the Navigators. The Navigators had been around for 70 years, and their particular niche was this one-on-one, life-to-life discipling. But I think about 15 years ago, they said, why aren't we helping congregations learn how to do this? So they formed CDM, Church Discipleship Ministry. Roy and Margaret are the heads of that. And so John and I went and met with them, and for 2 hours, John is sharing with them what he's writing in his book about making disciples. And the whole conversation, I'm just watching. Roy and Margaret are saying, well, that's what we do as the Navigators. And at the end of 2 hours, and this was an initial meeting, Roy and Margaret said, would you be interested in us putting together a proposal for how we, as the Navigators, might work with the North American Lutheran Church? And we said, yes. CDM, Church Discipleship Ministry, had worked with congregations. We're the first denomination with whom they're working. And so they came up with this model of the first year starting in 4 areas with about 4 congregations in a particular region. And we got 3 out of the 4 in the first wave, and now we're in the process of the second